For 38 years, the town of Millbrook believed it knew exactly who Etta Coldwater was. She was the widow who ran. She was the one who lived when 3 good men died, the stout woman with the burned hands who had abandoned her post at the grain elevator on the coldest night of 1961 and left the volunteer crew to carry the bodies out without her. Everyone knew it. Mothers pointed her out to their children on the far side of the street. And on the wall of the old firehouse, behind a locker she had bolted shut with her own hands, was the thing that would prove every one of them wrong. But nobody would learn that until the morning a dying man walked up the hill with a pair of bolt cutters and cut the chain off while the whole town watched. Before we begin, take a moment to subscribe and tell us where in the world you are listening from tonight. She had come to Millbrook a bride at 22, and she had buried her husband there 4 years later. Wendell Coldwater had been a lineman for the county, a tall, quiet man who whistled off key, and he had died the way careful men sometimes do, from a wire that should have been dead and was not. That left Etta with a rented room over the feed store, a widow's pension of $41 a month, and a town that had never quite decided whether she belonged to it. She was not from Millbrook. She talked a little too plain. She was broad through the shoulders and heavy in the hip, a farm girl's build, and she did not soften herself for anyone's comfort. So when the volunteer fire company put out a call for hands, and no one expected a woman to answer, Etta Coldwater walked into the squat brick Depot Street firehouse and asked for a coat. They gave her one because they were short, and because a fire does not care who carries the hose. She was good at it. She was strong, she was calm, and she did not flinch from smoke as some of the young men did. For 6 years she pulled her shifts, checked the pump, coiled the lines, and earned a narrow locker of her own along the back wall with a strip of tape that read her name. It was, she would say much later, the only place in that whole town that was truly hers, and what she would eventually lock inside it, and what it would take a dying man to reveal, is the reason her name is remembered in Millbrook at all today. But we are getting ahead of the cold. The night it happened, the temperature stood at 9 degrees below freezing. It was the 3rd week of January, 1961, and the wind came down off the ridge hard enough to lean on. The Ostrander grain elevator stood at the end of Depot Street, a great wooden tower packed to the roof with the autumn's corn, and grain dust, as any farmer will tell you, is not a quiet thing to burn. It hangs in the air fine as flour, and when it catches, it does not smoulder. It goes off. The first explosion blew the loading doors flat across the rail siding and lit the underside of the clouds a sick orange that people saw 4 miles off. By the time the siren pulled the volunteer crew out of their warm beds, the base of the tower was a wall of fire, and 3 men were already inside it. They were the night crew. Old Tobias Wren, who had run the elevator for 30 years, his son-in-law, Perry Hale, and a hired boy named Coy Dunlap, 17 years old, who had only taken the winter shift for the extra dollars. The 3 of them had been up on the 2nd floor, drawing samples when the dust let go beneath them, and the stair was gone before they could reach it. That was the situation the volunteers found when they arrived, hoses freezing in their hands. The fire chief, a stunned younger man named Orrin Faline, screaming for water pressure that the frozen hydrant would not give. And in the confusion, in the smoke, one figure in a heavy patched coat went in through the side door and did not come back out with the others. What the town decided had happened, and what had actually happened, were 2 different stories, and the difference between them slept behind a locked locker for 38 years. Here is what the town decided. When it was over, when the tower had come down in a roar of sparks and the 3 men were dead, Somebody counted heads on the frozen street and found Etta Coldwater sitting apart from the others in the snow, soot black to the elbows, her gloves gone, her hands raw and red and shaking, saying nothing at all. And a man named Delbert Ostrander, whose family owned the elevator and whose insurance now depended a great deal on whose fault the fire had been, looked at that silent woman sitting alone and said, loud enough for the whole crew to hear, she ran. I saw her come out the side while they were still calling for help. She saved her own skin and left them. Nobody contradicted him. Etta did not contradict him. She sat in the snow and looked at her ruined hands and said not one word in her own defence, then or ever, and to a frightened, grieving town, a silence like that looked exactly like guilt. Before the week was out, the story had hardened into fact. The widow ran. Stay with me, because the reason she stayed silent is the whole heart of this, and it will not come clear until the very end. They did not put her out of the fire company in so many words. They did not have to. When she came to the next meeting, the men would not look at her, and old Wren's daughter stood up and walked out rather than share a room with her, and the new coat they had ordered somehow never came in her size. So, Etta Coldwater took the tape with her name off the front of her locker, and she folded her coat inside it, and her helmet, and one other thing wrapped in oilcloth that nobody saw, and she ran a chain through the 2 door handles and closed a padlock over it, and she put the key in her pocket and walked out of that Depot Street firehouse for good, never once going back inside it again as long as she lived. That was the winter of 1961. She was 28 years old. The thing about a small town is that it has a long memory and a short heart. Millbrook did not forget, and it did not forgive, and it did not ask a single further question. Etta gave up the room over the feed store and took a smaller one at the edge of town, a tar paper place with a wood stove and a view of the ridge, and she went to work doing the only labour a woman with a ruined reputation and a pair of scarred hands could reliably get. She scrubbed floors. She took in washing. For a while she cleaned the school after the children had gone, on her knees in the empty halls where their mothers would not have suffered her near them by daylight. Her hands never fully healed. The skin across the backs of them had melted and drawn tight in the fire, gone shiny and red in ridges, and in the cold they cracked and bled, and she wrapped them in strips of an old sheet and kept scrubbing. She could have left. People asked her that. Later, the few who asked her anything. She could have gone to another county where nobody knew the story and started over clean. She never did. And why a woman would stay her whole life in the one place on earth that despised her, chained to a firehouse locker she would not open, is the question this whole story turns on. She stayed. Understand that she stayed on purpose, and hold on to that, because it is the first crack in the town's version of events. A coward runs from the scene. Etta Coldwater lived within sight of it for 38 years. The decades went over her as decades do. The elevator was never rebuilt, and the black bones of it were finally pushed into a heap and grassed over, and the young people of Millbrook grew up knowing the fire only as a thing their grandparents mentioned in a certain lowered voice, with a certain glance toward the heavy old woman in the patched coat who bought her flour on Tuesdays and spoke to no one. The volunteer company got newer trucks and forgot it had ever turned a woman away. Delbert Ostrander, who had spoken the word that damned her, collected his insurance, prospered, sat on the town board, and died respectable and mourned in 1984. And through all of it, the locker on the back wall of the Depot Street firehouse stayed chained shut. Because the fire company had a superstition about it by then, and because no one living remembered clearly what was inside, and because it was easier to paint around it than to ask. There was one man who knew. Stay with me, because here's the reason you are hearing this at all, and if you have not yet subscribed, do it now, because the next part is where a secret kept for a lifetime begins to come loose. His name was Orin Faline, and in 1961 he had been the young chief screaming for water on the frozen street. He was an old man now, past 80, thin as a rail and slow with a bad heart, living out at the county care home with a tank of oxygen and a great deal of time to think. And what he had been thinking about, more and more as the end of his own life came into view, was a single moment on the worst night of his career that had never once let him sleep easy. He had lied, not with words, but with silence, the same silence he had let the town build a story on. And now, dying, Orin Faline had decided he was not going to carry that silence into the ground. It was the spring of 1999 when he had a nephew drive him out to the tar paper house at the edge of town. Etta Coldwater was 66 by then, grey and heavier, her hands drawn into permanent half-fists by the old scars, and when she opened her door to the frail old man on her step she knew him at once, and her face closed like a fist itself. "I've got nothing to say to you," she told him. "Go home, Orin. I'm not here to make you talk," he said. His voice came thin around the oxygen line at his nose. "I'm here to tell you I'm sorry, and I'm here to ask you for the key." "There's no key." "There is," he said. "You've had it 38 years. I watched you turn it. And I've spent every one of those years knowing what's behind that locker and letting this town go on being wrong. Because I was young and I was scared, and I let a rich man's mouth do my thinking for me. I'm dying, Etta. I'd like to fix one thing before I do." She stood in the doorway a long time. The ridge wind moved the grass behind him, and then she said the thing that told Orin Faline he had guessed right about her all along. "Some things," she said quietly, "a person keeps shut for a reason. You leave that locker be." And she closed the door. But he did not leave it be. What Orin Faline did next is the moment this stops being a story about an old woman's stubbornness and becomes a story about what she had been protecting, and it is worth staying right here for. He went to the firehouse, and he sat down with the young volunteers who had never heard the real story, and he began to tell it. He described the pressure that never came from the frozen hydrant. He walked them through what had happened at the side door. And then he told them the one thing he had never told anyone, the thing he had seen with his own eyes and buried for a lifetime. And the young men sat very still and listened, and one of them went and pulled the old incident logs from the county archive to see for himself, because here is what the ledgers held, and what the town had never bothered to read. The official incident log from the night of the elevator fire had been written up 3 days afterward by the county recorder, a tidy account that named the 3 dead and listed the cause as grain dust ignition, and said nothing at all about how anyone had gotten near the bodies. But there was a second log, a field log. The chief on scene was required by county rule to keep a running tally in pencil on a card as the incident unfolded, times and hoses and men, and Orin Faline had kept his that night exactly as he was trained to, jamming it into his coat as the tower came down. And that card had never gone into the file. He had kept it, scorched at one corner where an ember had eaten through it, in a cigar box at the back of a drawer for 38 years because of what his own handwriting said on it. The young volunteer read it out to the room. In pencil, in a shaking hand, timed to the minute, it recorded that at 11:41 that Night 1 crew member had entered the structure by the south door against the chief's order. At 11:49 that same crew member had emerged dragging one man clear. At 11:53 entered again. At 11:58 emerged with a second. At 12:04, against every shout to stop, entered a third time into a tower that everyone on that street knew was about to fall. And beside that last line, Orin Faline had written 3 words and then never shown them to a living soul. The words were, Coldwater going back. She had not run. She had gone in 3 times. She had pulled Tobias Wren and the boy Coy Dunlap out to the snow with her bare hands after her gloves burned off, and she had gone back a 3rd time for Perry Hale, and the roof had come down while she was under it, and the blast of it had blown her back out the south door into the dark, which was the moment Delbert Ostrander saw her stagger clear and decided, for the sake of his insurance and his family's name, to call it running. But knowing a thing and proving it to a town that has spent 38 years believing the opposite are not the same, and this is where the story could still have died. Because the moment word of the old field log began to move through Millbrook, it ran straight into a man who did not want it heard. Delbert Ostrander's son ran the family holdings now, a smooth, heavy man in his 50s named Colvin. And Colvin Ostrander had built his whole standing in the county on the memory of his father as a pillar and a benefactor, a scorched pencil card that made the elder Ostrander a liar who had slandered a hero to save an insurance claim was not a piece of history Colvin cared to see nailed up in the firehouse. He moved as men like that move, quietly and from above. He reminded the town board that the Ostranders had paid for the firehouse roof and half its trucks. He suggested, in a soft, reasonable voice at a public meeting, that a dying old man's scribbled note was hardly proof of anything, that memories at 80 were unreliable, that dragging a good family's name through the mud on such a thing was cruelty dressed up as truth. My father, he said, standing in front of the room, was on that street trying to save those men. Now you want to make him the villain over one confused old fireman and a woman nobody could ever get a straight word out of. Where is her side of it? She's had 38 years to speak. She never has. Doesn't that tell you something? It was a clever thing to say, because it was true. Etta had never spoken. And Orin Faline, hearing that his one piece of paper was about to be voted into meaninglessness by a room that would rather keep its comfortable story, understood that the log by itself was not enough. He needed the one thing he had asked her for and been refused. He needed what was inside the locker. Because the field log proved she went in. Only Etta Coldwater knew why she had chained the rest of the truth away where it could not be argued with. So the old chief went back out to the tar paper house one more time, and this time he did not ask for the key. They're going to bury it, he told her through the screen door. Colvin Ostrander's going to stand up next Thursday and get the board to call my log a mistake, and this town is going to go right on calling you what it's called you your whole life. I can't stop it with a pencil card, Etta. There's only one thing left that can, and you locked it in that wall in 1961. He paused, breathing hard around the oxygen. I'm asking you to let me open it. Not for me. For those 3 men, and for what you did for them. For a long moment she said nothing, and he thought she would close the door again. Then she said, in a voice gone rough, You know what's in there. I know some of it, he said. I saw your hands that night. I've got a guess about the rest. Then you know why it stayed shut. She looked past him at the ridge. I didn't chain it out of shame, Orin. Whatever this town decided, I know what I did. I chained it because opening it meant saying out loud who else was in that fire, and there was a boy's mother in this town who didn't need to hear the particulars of how her son died. She's gone now. 2 winters back. Her jaw worked. I suppose there's no one left to protect but me, and I stopped mattering to myself a long time ago. You matter, the old man said to the truth. Let me cut it off. And Etta Coldwater, 66 years old, who had guarded that chain longer than most of Millbrook had been alive, reached into the pocket of her apron and did not bring out the key. Instead, she said, The key rusted shut in 62. I threw it in the creek. If you want in there, you'll have to cut the chain in front of the whole lot of them. And if you're going to do that, Oren Phelim, you're going to do it with everyone watching, so there's no soul left in this town who can say afterward it was faked in the dark. You understand me? All of them. In the daylight. It was not permission. It was a challenge, and the frail old chief, for the first time in 38 years, smiled. He called it a memorial. That was how he got them there. He put word about that on the coming Saturday at the Depot Street Firehouse. The volunteer company would honour the 3 men lost in the elevator fire, and a town that loves nothing so much as its own grief turned out in numbers. They came in the raw grey of a foggy dawn, breath-fogging, coats buttoned to the chin, and they filled the yard before the low squat brick building where the old locker had stood chained for a lifetime. Colvin Ostrander came too, near the front, arms folded, certain he had already won the argument that mattered. And then, out of the mist, came Etta Coldwater. She came up the hill on her own 2 feet in a heavy patched coat, grey hair pinned back. Her scarred red hands closed around the handles of a pair of long-handled bolt cutters nearly as tall as she was. The crowd went quiet, as a crowd does when it does not understand what it is seeing. She walked straight to the front of the firehouse, to the low brick wall beside the door, and she set the cutters down and waited while 2 of the young volunteers wheeled the old locker out into the yard where all could see it, the chain still looped through both handles, the padlock rusted the colour of dried blood. Oren Phelim stood beside her with his oxygen tank on a little cart. He did not make a long speech. He held up the scorched pencil card so the fog-damp morning light fell on it, and he read the times out loud: 11:41, 11:49, 11:53, 11:58, 12:04, and the 3 words at the bottom, and his old voice did not shake. Then he turned to the woman beside him. For 38 years, he said to the town, you have called this woman a coward. I let you. That is my shame, and I will die with it. But I will not let you keep hers. He looked at Etta. Whenever you're ready. Colvin Ostrander stepped forward. This is theatre, he said loudly. A note and a locked box. Anything could be in there. My father is not here to answer, and I won't have his name. Then watch, Etta said. It was the first word most of them had heard her speak in years, and it stopped him cold. She picked up the bolt cutters. She was 66, and her hands were ruined, and it took her 3 tries and every bit of her broad, strong shoulders, and no one moved to help her, because they understood, all at once, that this was hers to do. On the 3rd heave the blades bit through, and the rusted chain fell open with a sound like a struck bell and dropped into the wet grass. The whole yard held its breath. Etta pulled the 2 doors of the locker open, and the smell of 38-year-old smoke came out into the morning. Inside hung her old volunteer coat, stiff and black down one whole side where the fire had cooked it. Her helmet, the paint blistered off it. And there, on the hook, wrapped in an oilcloth gone brittle with age, was the thing she unwrapped now with her scarred fingers and held up over her head so that every soul in that yard could see it. It was a single fireman's glove. What was left of one. The leather had burned to a hard black claw, curled and split and fused into the seared palm of it, melted right into the ruined leather, were the shapes of things the crowd slowly, sickly, understood, a brass button from the boy Coy Dunlap's work shirt. A bit of a buckle. The glove she had worn on the hand she reached into the fire with, the 3rd time, when the roof came down on Perry Hale, and it had burned onto her so hard that when they finally got it off her hands in the days after, the skin had come with it, which was why her hands were what they were, and why she had never been able to make a fist since. You wanted to know why I never spoke, she said, and her voice carried across the still yard. I went in 3 times. I got Tobias out. I got the boy out. I went back for Perry, and the world came down. This glove is what I brought out of that fire instead of him. I couldn't get him. I couldn't reach him. And I have spent 38 years unable to open this door, because opening it meant standing here telling that boy's mother and that man's widow that I was close enough to burn my hands off and still not close enough. I let you call me a coward, because a coward is an easier thing for a grieving town to bury than the truth, which is that sometimes a person does everything right and it is still not enough. I did not stay silent to hide what I did. I stayed silent to spare the people who lost more than I did. She lowered the burned glove. But they're gone now. All of them, so I'll say it once, in the daylight, with all of you watching, just as I was asked. I did not run. I was the last one out, because I was the last one in. Nobody in that yard spoke. And then a woman near the back, old herself now, who had been a girl of 19 the winter of the fire and Perry Hale's own daughter, put both her hands over her mouth and began to weep, because she had grown up believing a coward had let her father die, and she was learning in one grey morning that a hero had burned her hands to the bone trying to save him. Colvin Ostrander stood very still in the front of the crowd, with his mouth open and no more words in it, and when the eyes of the town began, one pair at a time, to turn toward him and away from the woman with the glove, he did the thing that men like him always do at the end. He walked away, he got in his car and he drove down the hill, and Millbrook let him go, and something that his family had held over that town for 38 years went down the road with him and did not come back. They did not fix it all at once, because towns do not. But the young volunteers carried the scorched locker back inside and hung it where it had always been, and this time they did not chain it. They framed the burned glove and the scorched pencil card together behind glass, and under it they set a small brass plate that a town which had spent a lifetime being wrong paid for out of its own pocket. It did not say much. It said her name, the date, and she went in 3 times. That was all. It was enough. Orrin Faline lived to see it hung. He died that same autumn, in his sleep, and they said afterward that he went easier than a man with that heart had any right to, and those who knew the story understood why. And Etta Coldwater, who had scrubbed floors in a town that despised her for the better part of 40 years, found in the last stretch of her life that people who had crossed the street from her all their lives now stopped her on it to take her ruined hands in both of theirs and hold them, gently, the way you hold something you have finally understood the worth of. She let them. She had never wanted to be a hero. She had only ever wanted the one thing the fire took and the town took after it, which was to belong somewhere, and in the end the squat brick firehouse on Depot Street and the wall she had chained shut against them gave it back to her. She started going in again on Tuesdays after she bought her flour. She would sit a while in the bay by the trucks and talk to the young volunteers about pump pressure and frozen hydrants and how to breathe low in the smoke, and they wrote it down, because they had finally figured out that the heavy old woman with the scarred hands knew more about walking into fire than any of them ever would. The locker stayed open, the glove stayed on the wall, and her name, which the town had made a byword for cowardice for the better part of a lifetime, became instead the thing they taught the new ones first. So think, for a moment, of the people you have been sure you had figured out. The quiet one who never explained herself. The one everybody agreed about. Because some people carry a silence not because they have something to hide, but because they are carrying something too heavy to set down in front of you, and it can take a lifetime and a dying man with a pair of bolt cutters before anyone thinks to ask what is really behind the locked door. Etta Coldwater was never the coward of Millbrook. She was the only one who ran toward the fire. And if there is someone in your own town that everyone has already decided about, someone you have quietly crossed the street from, maybe the kindest thing any of us can do is walk up the hill in the fog and ask to see what's behind the chain, before it's too late to cut it off.